This week we'll finish up with anatomy, specifically considering respiratory, urogenital, and sensory systems. Turns out, let's start with respiration. Birds have a really unique respiratory system. Air enters the mouth and passes through the glottis into the trachea, just like us. The trachea then splits into two bronchi, right, which enter the lung. This sounds like the typical mammalian system, but there's also a remarkable system of air sacs that allow for one-way flow of air through the lungs. So we're going to have to explain this. Most birds have 4 pairs of air sacs and 1 unpaired air sac. So there's 2 pairs in the posterior part of the bird, the posterior thoracic and the abdominal air sacs. There's 2 more anteriorly, so you have the anterior thoracic air sac, and you have the cervical air sac. It was also paired. Then there's one in between that's unpaired called the interclavicular air sac. Okay, now the air sacs are essentially non-vascularized storage areas. So there's simply air stored in there. Well, how does all this work? Let's take a look at another little diagram here. And you can see the trachea going down into the sound-producing organ called the syrinx, then splitting to the 2 bronchi, and then moving on down the mesobronchus on the backside of the bird, right, dorsally. And then from the mesobronchus, basically where you no longer see cartilaginous rings, so you're getting into the lungs at that point. These mesobronchi will give off 4 to 6 dorsobronchi. So now we're talking dorsally on the backside of the bird, okay? And then those dorsobronchi themselves divide into what are called parabronchi. So now we're going down toward ventral side through the lungs. The parabronchi are now getting tiny, 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 right? The walls of the parabronchi are punctured with air capillaries, and we're down to the size where they're smaller than mammalian alveoli. The parabronchi are surrounded by blood capillaries that flow across the direction of airflow, and this is where the gas exchange takes place. Now, there are no blind pouches or alveoli in the lung, right? This is a complete flow-through system. The parabronchi then join again as ventrobronchi. Now we're ventral on the bottom side of the bird, and flow into the mesobronchi again, and then out. Now wait, how do the air sacs fit into this? Okay, so you see here all the air sacs are labeled, and this is how it works. We're going to take a look at another diagram. Unfortunately, the dorsobronchi and the ventrobronchi in this diagram are not dorsal and ventral. They should have drawn it that way, but that aside, here's how it works. It takes 2 inspiration and expiration, or inhalation, exhalation cycles for a particle of air to get through the entire system. So the first inhalation, air flows to the posterior air sacs. Here we go. Ooh, back here, see, these air sacs are filling up with air. Then air exhalation. Exhalation 1, air flows through the dorsobronchi into the parabronchi. So here, out of these air sacs into the parabronchi. Now gas exchange is taking place, right? Then comes inhalation number 2. Comes out of the parabronchi into the anterior air sacs, or interclavicular air sac, right? And now expiration number 2, or exhalation number 2. These air sacs squish, the anterior ones, and air goes out the trachea again, right? So it takes 2 complete cycles. There's no valves present that anyone has found to prevent inhaled air from going to the anterior and posterior air sacs. Rather, it seems like fluid dynamics are what determine the pathway of airflow. I mean, it's weird. You look at this system, you go, well, if air is going to be inspired, and then on the next exhalation, why doesn't it just go back out where it came? There's no valves. No one's ever found valves. For some reason, the fluid flow is such that it goes into the lungs and then into the anterior sacs and out from there. So it's interesting and almost a mystery still exactly how this whole thing works without valves. The sternum is lowered during inhalation, and the lungs decrease in size while the air sacs increase, and then the reverse on the exhalation. This whole system was figured out by putting probes in different parts of the system and having an ostrich breathe in pure oxygen, and you just see which parts get more highly oxygenated bloods when. So the first inspiration, you see the posterior air sacs getting high oxygen, then you see the lungs getting high oxygen and exhalation, then the anterior getting high oxygen on the inhalation, then out. So here's one more view of the process. See if you get it here. So the air sac inhalation goes to the back, into the lungs, inhalation to the anterior, out. So air sac system can also serve other functions. Remember, it's air filled, so probably helps keep hot birds cool through evaporation of water internally. There's certainly a lot of area available for that. And as we talked about, these can be used in display by male birds, where they may ingest some of the air, have the anterior air sacs expand and be involved in displays by grouse or frigate birds and things like that. So that is the respiratory system. One more really cool thing, some large birds have really long tracheas. You can see in lab there's a part of a skeleton of a trumpeter swan where you can see the trachea gets wound up inside the carina. My God, what's going on? For a long time it was believed that the passage of pure oxygen over the lung surface would draw too much carbon dioxide out of the blood and upset the bird's pH balance. This would be especially true for big birds because they have a huge tidal volume. Their wing beat frequency is so slow that they're taking in 10,000 gallons of air and out goes another 10,000 gallons. So they have to have such huge tidal volumes. It's thought, wow, that's when they're really going to suffer by having too oxygenated a blood. And so the thought was if you expand the length of the trachea, you'll have more dead air space, and that'll help dilute the concentration of oxygen to make it a little better. Well, that story's pretty much been dumped because people find that the birds with these long tracheas also have amazing vocal capabilities. And even some small birds, no bigger than a flicker, like these birds of paradise, look at the trachea. They have a trachea that's like over a meter long. So here's a bird, you can hold in your hand with a trachea that would drop to the floor practically. So air goes in on inhalation to the lungs, and on exhalation, huge distance. It's amazing. But it turns out, by the work of Mary Clench, who studied these birds of paradise, these are the only passerines known to exhibit this phenomenon of elongated tracheas, right? And in both genera, the looping of the trachea is superficial between the skin and the muscle, like the figure shows here. And it turns out older males have much longer trachea than young males, which show little or no elongation. And females don't have an elongated trachea at all. So older birds may have these overlapping trachea 2 layers deep, right? And these birds have penetrating calls through the tropical forest. And she believes the length serves to lower and possibly amplify calls in these birds. And undoubtedly the same thing's going on with trumpeter swans and whooping cranes and things like that. Okay, here's another cool bit of insight from respiratory system of birds. Why has viviparity never evolved in birds? They're the only vertebrate group without live bearing. So the reason may be due to the unique respiratory system. Now in mammals at parturition, right, young can inflate their lungs quickly since the air capillaries aren't too small. So, we have a little baby, and the baby pops out and you spank it, takes a breath and everything's cool. In birds, since the parabronchi are so tiny, it may take much more time to inflate the lung completely before it becomes fully functional with gas exchange because of the tiny, tiny air capillaries, right? This extra time is thought to be provided by a hard egg environment. There, when the bird's still in the egg, there's airspace at one end of the egg, right? It allows the bird to aerate the lungs prior to hatching. So it's thought to be linked to the respiratory system. Urogenital system. You need to note the box terms on the handout. Basically, starting with the left side, you can take a look at the kidneys. You do the same thing in birds that they do in mammals. They concentrate urine, which is excreted through the ureters. There's no bladder in birds except for some of the bigger ostriches and rheas. Basically, most birds no bladder. Urine is mostly uric acid instead of urea. Okay, chemically different structure. Uric acid has twice as many nitrogen molecules, right? And it's relatively insoluble, right? So it's not going to be floating around, breaking up in water. So water can be conserved since it takes less water to get rid of a given amount of nitrogen. So birds excrete, it turns out, their urine or uric acid 100 times more concentrated than kangaroo rats. I mean, talk about concentrated uric acid. That is getting there. So it's thought that the excretion of uric acid is also related to having eggs. Both reptiles and birds excrete uric acid, and they both lay eggs. And since uric acid is insoluble in water, it can concentrate in the allantois without poisoning the bird until hatching time. If it were soluble, it might just poison the bird sitting there in the egg. That's the thought. Okay, take a look at, think about male versus female. The female is the heterogametic sex in birds. That's interesting. You know, in mammals, the male's XY, female XX. In birds, it's the opposite. In females, only the left oviduct and ovary develops in most species. You see the diagram here. In some hawks and falcons, however, about half the females have both ovaries. But even in these cases, usually the left one is the only one producing an egg. So the ovary greatly enlarges during the breeding season, as do the testes, as a result of the follicle-stimulating hormone released from the pituitary. And then they shrink after the breeding season. So take a sort of expanded look at the ovary and oviduct here and think about the formation of eggs. You ought to know something about how this happens. So take a look at the top of the diagram. There's the ovary, which has a collection of eggs, or ova, OVA, a bunch of eggs, one egg, ovum. One ovum is then released into the infundibulum, right, which is at the anterior end of the oviduct, and sits there for 15 minutes, to a half an hour, then moved by ciliary action onto the magnum region of the oviduct. And in the magnum region, may sit for a few hours where it gets the albumin. So the egg white basically is being deposited there. Then it continues moving down into the isthmus region for about an hour where it gets the shell membrane. So they have the membrane basically inside the calcified hardened egg. There's going to be a membrane. That's what happens in the isthmus. Then into the uterus region. Now that's where it's going to get the outer shell, and it's going to be sitting down in the uterus region for 20 hours, which is amazingly long period of time compared to the entire trip down the oviduct. So here, the egg is going to be getting the hard calcified covering, and it's going to be getting color if it gets color, and it's going to be getting spots if it gets spots, and it's going to get twirled around if it gets swirls. So this is where all the magic of the coloration happens. Then finally passes into the vagina and then is laid about 24 hours after it was released from the ovary. So it takes about a day for the egg to be formed. So birds will be laying about one egg a day. And down the bottom right, you can see an example of the variety of egg colors and sizes and shapes even in the bird world. And you have to ask yourself, just looking at that, oh my gosh, I wonder why natural selection has favored this particular kind of egg. And there are answers to those questions. Now, the males. Some male birds have a sort of penis. It's a groove structure, which is best developed in flightless birds and ducks. So here, this diagram in the upper right shows, some galliforms, chicken, and seriforms. The ducks may have something analogous to a penis, but most birds only have what's called a cloacal protuberance, which results from the hypertrophy of seminal sacs during the breeding season. So take a look at the figure there. You blow on a bird, its feathers separate, and then you can see down here this little bulging area by the cloaca. That would be a male. So you can tell the male basically from female, and that's how you can sex birds when you're doing bird banding. Sensory system. We're just going to consider the brain in lab, and we'll talk about other sensory organs in lecture. And basically, in the lab, we're just going to look at this diagram of the brain and note that birds, yes, they have a fore, mid, and hind brain like mammals. They have evolved an enlarged cerebrum and cerebellum, right? The cerebrum in both birds and mammals has a cortex, outer cortex here, and a striatum. We have tiny little paleo and archostriatum listed right here. But birds, the cortex is tiny, 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 right? And the striatum is huge, covering most of the cerebrum. In fact, there's parts of the striatum, the hyperstriatum and the vulst, up in the anterior part, that mammals don't even have. So with mammals, the cortex has become dominant with a lot of infolding. Birds, the opposite occurred. The cortex is a thin covering on the top side and is very smooth. And the uppermost portion, as I said, of the striatum, the hyperstriatum, is not even present in mammals. Well, the cortex is associated with intelligence in mammals, right? So are birds stupid? No. The hyperstriatum has taken on the function of the mammalian cortex in birds. So it's just different parts of the brain have taken on similar functions. So we'll talk about intelligence in birds in the lecture. One of the things about birds that's amazing, this guy Notebaum showed that vocal control areas in the hyperstriatum anteriorly are significantly larger in male than female zebra finches. This was the first example of gross sexual dimorphism in a vertebrate brain. And in his plenary lecture at the AOU meetings in New York in 1984 or so, Notebaum showed that neural networks actually grow during the song learning period and then disappear after the breeding season. So you can get changes in the size of the brain depending on when they need to use that particular portion of the brain. Amazing. And now we know that this phenomenon is much more general than we ever believed in the past. We'll discuss, again, a little of this in lecture and other sensory organs, because birds have amazing properties related to vision and hearing, smell, touch. So that's it for this week's lab.